Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Sometimes guests that are walking around the park will stop in place to admire the rides or scenery next to them. They even take pictures of it because it is truly a life-altering experience to behold this slab of brown material. For a long time I have wondered how this exactly works, when do they watch, what do they watch, and now I have finally done the research. And my god, this is the most effort I have ever seen put into a feature that is almost entirely for aesthetic purposes. It's insane how much detail is put into this feature while it has nearly zero effects on the guests, other than preventing them from going somewhere else for a little while. And there's also a bunch of really weird things about it that are either very strange decisions or unintentional bugs. It all starts with determining when a guest should attempt to find something to look at. This is not done on a set interval, but rather it happens whenever they reach the middle of a path tile, so it heavily depends on their walking speed. More energetic guests are faster, so they see more of the park and thus will look at stuff more frequently. When they reach the middle and this check goes off, there are a whole bunch of other checks that can discourage the guests from trying to find something to look at. They need to have at least 120 happiness and no more than 140 nausea and toilet. They also cannot be in the state of leaving the park, as then they just want to get home and don't care about pretty stuff. And then, after all these checks have passed, there is a random chance involved. By default, there is only a 4.3% chance that they will actually try to watch on every path piece, but if they have a food or drink item, then this jumps to a 20% chance. This means that if you put the right stuff next to a food court, you will get quite a lot of watching guests, which looks nice. Okay, so a guest has arrived at the middle of a path piece, they're happy enough, aren't too nauseous and don't need to pee too badly, are not going home, and they also passed the random chance. They now select a random edge of the path and check if there is something interesting to look at in that direction. Usually a path only has 2 edges that can be used for watching, but if it's a dead end then it has 3, and if the park owner is cruel then a guest might even find themselves on a path piece with 4 edges. And of course 1 edge if it's a junction, or even 0 edges when it's a crossroads is also possible. Sloped path pieces do not count, by the way. Guests cannot watch from these, and for the purpose of this video you could see them as always having 0 valid edges to watch from. If the path piece is level, there are now 3 factors that determine whether a guest can find something to watch in the chosen direction or not. Firstly, there obviously needs to be something that is interesting enough in that direction, then it also needs to be close enough, and lastly it needs to be not obscured by other scenery or by rides. We'll start with what counts as interesting. Both rides and scenery can be interesting, and for scenery it depends on whether it's considered to be photogenic. A simple flower bed will not be photogenic enough to stop and watch, but the Colosseum will be. There are no specific rules that you can follow to determine which scenery items are considered photogenic and which are not, you just have to check it every time, or if you're a nerd, learn it by heart. The one rule you can follow is that all the photogenic scenery items are more than 1 tile big and considered large scenery, but not all large scenery counts. For example, the Sphinx and Pyramid are photogenic, but from the same scenery theme, the Colonnade is not. That's not entirely unexpected, and if you look at the 10 items from the base game that are considered photogenic, then there's a clear trend that they're all really cool big things. An ice palace, a pirate ship, a rocket, a pyramid, it makes sense. That logic breaks down a bit when looking at the expansions though. Here are 6 large scenery items from the expansions. Can you guess which ones of these are photogenic? Go on, try it. You will not get it right, not a chance in hell. Atomium, photogenic. Eiffel Tower, not photogenic. Random roof piece, photogenic. Slightly different random roof piece. Nope. Statue of Liberty, also not photogenic, but the futuristic looking one surely is. It makes no sense whatsoever. Why are, from the Europe theming, Big Ben, a windmill and the Atomium cool, but the Eiffel Tower and rocket are not? Why are 2 of these 3 roof pieces boring while the smallest one is photogenic? And why are 4 of these 5 massive roof pieces picture worthy while the other one isn't? There is no rhyme or reason at all to which items of the expansions are photogenic and which are not. And even when it is consistent, it still makes a lot of boring items photogenic, such as this tent, these 4 harbor pieces, this roof and this little hut. And in general, the expansions have a lot more massive scenery items, so it's also gonna have a lot more cool looking ones. Here are all the photogenic scenery items grouped by scenery theme, and the longer you look at it, the more you will find that's wrong with it. I do at some point want to make a video about everything that is wrong with RollerCoaster Tycoon 2's expansions, because I can probably fill an entire hour with that. Okay, enough ranting now. Outside of these 136 scenery items, guests can also look at rides. If a ride is still under construction, then it's always interesting enough, as watching a new ride being built is genuinely quite interesting. You don't have to actively be building the ride though, the game simply looks at whether it's closed and whether it has no stats yet, and if both of those things are true, then it's considered to be under construction. Rides with stats that are also open can also be valid watching targets, and they are if one of the following 4 things is true. It has at least 4.7 excitement, it has at least 4.5 intensity, it is interesting and passes the random check, or it is slightly interesting and passes the less likely random check. Those first 2 make sense, it's just an excitement and intensity check, and if one of them is high enough, the ride is cool enough to watch. But what on earth does interesting and slightly interesting mean? Well, just like scenery, there are certain ride types that can make guests look at them even if their stats are not above the thresholds. All of these ride types, and also all roller coasters, are considered interesting to look at, and that means that if they aren't exciting or intense enough, there is still a 20% chance that the guests will look at it anyway. These are mostly flat rides or small tracked rides that are unlikely to have high enough stats but look cool anyway. Roller coasters do usually get above the required excitement or intensity and thus often always pass this check, but if they don't, then there is still a 20% chance that they pass anyway because they're flagged as interesting. But of course this wasn't complicated enough for Chris Sawyer, and he also created a slightly interesting category of rides, which are all of these. It functions the same, but this time there's only a 6% chance of still making guests look at them if the excitement and intensity checks fail, instead of a 20% chance. These tend to be gentle rides that have even lower stats than the ones from the interesting group, but are still slightly interesting. The last group is the uninteresting rides, which are all of these and all stalls. Some of them, like the observation tower, can still be watched if their stats are high enough, but others, like the maze or circus, cannot ever get high enough stats, so they will never be looked at outside of when they're under construction. Oh, and any reskin of a ride type has the same interestingness as what I showed here. So for example, all 11 twist variants, yeah there's 11, are interesting. The maze ride and time machine are slightly interesting because they're space rings, and the funhouse, hall of mirrors and haunted jailhouse are all uninteresting because they're just a different looking crooked house. Stalls cannot be under construction and are also not flagged as interesting, so they will never be watched. It is truly astonishing how complicated this all is. First, there is the group of photogenic scenery items, and then there are the closed rides with no ratings, the opened rides with at least 4.7 excitement and 4.5 nausea, and also the group of interesting and slightly interesting rides that only have a chance of being worthy of being looked at. That is the first condition, that there is an interesting thing, but that thing also has to be in the right position. Firstly, it needs to be within 3 tiles of the path that the guest is standing on. Too far away, 1 tile to the side, behind them or above the path itself all doesn't work. At least 1 tile of the scenery item or ride needs to be on one of these 3 tiles. But not anywhere on these tiles will do, it also needs to be within a certain vertical distance of the guest. The photogenic scenery item or cool ride needs to be within the space taken up by these orange blocks. The lower limit is 1 unit below the path level, and the upper limit is 3.5 units above it on the first tile, 4.5 units on the second tile, and 5.5 units on the third tile. Let me show you what exactly this means. A track piece here will not get people to watch as it's above all the orange stuff, but if I lower it 1 unit, then it is within that range, as evidenced by it deleting the top block, and now guests do start watching it. It's the same on the bottom, but this can sometimes be a bit confusing. For example, why does the boat hire not attract any onlookers while the junior coaster does? That's because while the junior coaster has a clearance of 1.5 units and therefore takes up space in the orange area, the boat hire has a clearance of only 1 unit and is fully below the area. The same confusion can happen with inverted coaster pieces at the top of the range. They might not look like they are in the area, but they take up a fair bit of space below the track, as that's where the train needs to travel. The most ridiculous example I have found is this super photogenic skyscraper roof. It is incredibly far down, yet guests are looking at it anyway. That is because Frontier for some reason felt the need to give this a massive amount of clearance, and it does indeed slightly go into the viewing space of the guests. Okay, so that's the what and where, but even if the thing is interesting and is in the correct bit of space, it can still be invalid as it can be blocked by other evil scenery pieces or rides. This part has a couple of really confusing and strange bits, so pay close attention. The core idea is quite simple, and that is that if there is a scenery item or ride in front of the interesting thing, then it will block the view of it. For example, this wall, statue, pink tree and boat hire all block the view of the big photogenic mangrove tree behind it. That still kinda makes sense, and the limits for where something can be without blocking the view are also quite logical. If something is within the orange viewing area of the first tile, it will obscure anything that is on the second or third tile, and similarly any ride or scenery item within the orange bit on the second tile will obscure anything that's on the third tile. Things do not obscure anything that's on the same tile though, so you can put as much stuff above and below this track piece as you like and guests will still watch it. Where it gets weird is the walls, as they are a different category of scenery items and they really behave quite oddly here. Generally, walls do work the same as other scenery items here, and a wall piece on the first tile will block the view of the second and third tile like we saw before. While this is a bit weird for sideways walls, as realistically they would not obscure the view, it does make sense from a game logic perspective, as it is a scenery item that's in the way. But there is a coding mistake for the wall on the side of the first tile that is the closest to the path, as here there is no upper limit to where it can block the view. You can see all the purple walls here, and guests are happily watching the track piece on the tile behind it, but there is one section missing, because if I place a wall above the guests on that edge, no matter how high up, it will always block the view. The second weird thing about walls is when they are on the same tile as the interesting thing, because while all the flower beds below and above this track piece do not obscure it, walls that are on that tile and between it and the path can certainly block the view, but the limits are different. For some reason, those walls are allowed to extend one more unit upwards and half a unit further downwards than any scenery item on the tile in front of it. So you can get a very odd situation that both the green and purple walls here are as far up and downward as they can go without obscuring the view of the thing on the second tile. If you place a purple wall directly against one of the exposed green wall pieces, then suddenly guests cannot see the log flume behind it anymore. But of course, there is again a bug with the wall on the path side of the first tile. If the cool thing is on the first tile, then for the wall on the same tile you again cannot build anything high up. But the lower limit is also much higher and you can build something that looks like it should fully obscure the view, but it doesn't, as guests can see through this wall, but only if the thing they're looking at is on the first tile, not if it's on the second or third. And finally, there is the wall that is on the path tile that the guests are standing on. This one is really quite simple, and guests only need a 1.5 unit gap of free space to be able to look through it to see whatever is behind it, no matter on which of the 3 tiles it is. I like that they are able to see over a small half unit wall, that is quite a nice realistic touch. To summarize this all and to make it hopefully a bit clearer, here are all the exact limits of how far up and down you can go with walls without blocking the view, depending on how far away the cool thing is. And the sideways walls also represent the limits of where normal scenery items and rides can go without obscuring anything. Looking at this in its entirety shows how little sense this all makes, and my first instinct was that perhaps OpenRCT2 made an implementation mistake, as sometimes happens. But nope, I tested it and it's all exactly the same as in the original game, so this can entirely be pinned on Chris Sawyer. There is a twist though, and that is that some walls are transparent and will let guests see through them anyway, such as the mesh fence and the castle gate. Even though these are within the area that we just saw that needs to be kept free, guests are still watching the thing behind them as they can see through them, whereas next to it they are not watching as those walls are not see-through. Here are all the transparent walls, which is a fairly small collection. They mostly do make sense, except the Texas Giant sign and the castle gate if you consider that they can also look through the very solid top bit of it. And most interestingly, there are no walls at all from the Wacky Worlds and Time Twister expansions here. While they slapped a photogenic sticker on half of the big scenery items, they completely forgot that the transparent flag exists for wall scenery, as some of these really look like they should be transparent. Normal scenery items and rides cannot be transparent though, and it is quite hilarious that these 4 tiny flower beds obscure the massive Colosseum behind it. It's like an elephant hiding behind a lamppost in a game of hide and seek. Usually that wouldn't quite work, but in the RollerCoaster Tycoon universe, it just might. Here's another weird example with two futuristic statues of liberty, because remember, the normal one is not photogenic. The one on the standard terrain is viewable, but the other one, where I replaced the ground level with base blocks, is obscured by the 4 blocks in between it and the path. Those blocks are within the possible viewing area, so they always obscure whatever is behind it, no matter how big and massive and futuristic that thing is. Rides that obscure something is an interesting phenomenon as well, as you might not always notice that it does, as the ride itself is often also worthy of being watched. Here is a pyramid and people are happily watching it. If I start building a railway around it, it looks like they're still watching the pyramid, but if you look closely, they are actually watching the railway, as evidenced by the fact that they are now looking straight ahead instead of upwards. The railway is considered interesting because it's under construction, but as soon as I open it, it becomes boring, and guests will stop watching it and also still can't watch the pyramid as the railway blocks it from view, so nothing is being watched. Ride entrance and exit buildings also block the view, even if they are from a ride that itself is considered interesting enough. You can see here that the coaster gets watched everywhere except where the entrance and exit are. And it doesn't matter if it's under construction or anything, these two buildings are not considered part of the ride for this purpose and always block the view. What doesn't block the view is path, and neither does a massive terrain wall. Yeah, guests can see through this and watch whatever's behind it. However, if the scenery or ride is built underground, then guests cannot look at it, as the game only looks at items above the surface. Really stunning game design. Being underground blocks a ride from being viewed, but a massive terrain wall in front of it does not. I know that one is a lot easier to program than the other, but it's still funny. Let's now look at some examples in a real park instead of these carefully constructed setups to show you how it works. This pagoda is photogenic and is close enough to both paths, but because there is scenery in between, guests cannot ever watch it. They can watch this looping coaster here since it is exciting enough, the fence that's in the way is transparent, and the bushes below the track itself cannot obscure it since they're on the same tile. This long flume can be watched from various points on the pier around it, although in quite a few places it is blocked by the reeds on the water. The same goes for this rocket, which is interesting enough and in a few places not blocked by other scenery, so guests can watch it from there. If you don't build much scenery like I did in this park, then guests have far more opportunities to watch rides. The majority of path pieces are close enough to an unobscured interesting track piece, so many more guests will choose to watch them. The more scenery there is, the less likely guests are to watch, which is very counterintuitive, but it's true. Unless of course you spam only big photogenic scenery items, but who does that? To recap, when arriving at the center of a path tile, guests will, if they're happy enough, don't need to puke or go to the toilet too badly and pass a random check, pick a random path edge to see if there's something interesting to look at. They will look at any photogenic large scenery item or ride that is under construction, exciting or intense enough, or sometimes if it's interesting, or even less sometimes if it's slightly interesting. A part of the scenery item or ride has to be within 3 tiles and a certain vertical area of the path piece, which is represented by these orange blocks. But then it still may be obscured if there is a ride, a normal scenery item or a non-transparent wall in the way, or if the thing is underground. There is a chance that in the future OpenRCT2 will alter some of these things that do not make sense at all. I'm talking about which scenery items are photogenic, which walls are transparent, and where scenery and rides can be without blocking the view. Because let's face it, this roof piece should never be photogenic, this wall from the expansions should absolutely be transparent, and if this yellow wall does not obscure the view, then neither should this green wall, which currently does obscure the view. But also, credit where credit is due, OpenRCT2 copied the weirdness from Vanilla perfectly. The guest now has determined that there is something they can and want to look at, but there also needs to be space for them to stand. Every path tile has 4 spaces for guests to watch, which is quite generous. But some of these spaces can also be blocked. Lamps, bins, jumping fountains and TVs are all fine and they don't take away any watching spots, but benches, which are bigger, do take away the middle 2 and only leave the outer 2 spaces open. This is where OpenRCT2 did have a bug and had this reversed for a long time, where the only addition that would keep the 4 spaces was the bench, making people trample all over the folks sitting on it. While funny and even somewhat realistic, because some people are just rude, it was a bug and it has been fixed now. Assuming that there is space, the guests will pick a random available spot, walk to it and start watching, which allows us to take a look at their behavior while doing it. Firstly, how long do they stand around for? That is a bit of a tricky question because it involves the energy of the guests twice in two different ways. First, a variable called time to stand gets calculated. Guest energy goes from 32 to 128, and if it's 100 or less, then time to stand gets maxed out to a value of 255. Only if the guest is very energetic does this start to go down, and from 255 at 100 energy it goes down linearly to a time to watch of just 33 at the maximum of 128 energy. So far, it seems like most guests are gonna be watching for the same time of 255 of these units, but the speed at which this number decreases also depends on the energy of the guest, and the less energy they have, the slower it goes down. For a guest with a maximum of 128 energy, this will decrease 10 times per second, leading to a watching time of just 3.3 seconds. Then, as the guest energy decreases, this number also starts decreasing slower and slower, and since the lowest energy is 4 times lower than the highest, as just 32, this number also decreases 4 times slower at just 2.5 times a second. With that rate, the time to stand value of 255 comes to an actual standing time of an impressive 101 seconds, about 30 times longer than the most energized guest. Here is a graph of the watching time in seconds compared to the energy of the guest. Because the energy is taken into account in two different ways, it's not a smooth graph. No part of it is linear, but it's not even one smooth curve, as it really is two different curves combined. This ride watching is quite an obscure function, and it doesn't even serve any kind of proper gameplay mechanic, and yet it is complicated enough that we're getting out the damn graphs. But if you're still here after 21 minutes, then I assume you're into this kind of stuff. And it's not over yet, because as we saw earlier during the demonstration of the pyramid and the railway, there are also two different ways that they can look at the ride or scenery. They can look at it straight on, or they can look up. If any part of the thing they look at is at least 3.5 units off the ground, which is above this tower of 7 base blocks, then they will look up instead of straight ahead. But what about this situation? Do they look straight ahead at the piece right in front of them, or do they look up at the piece above it? The answer is straight ahead, because the game checks each tile from the bottom up, and the guests look at the first interesting thing that the game detects. So in this case they find the wooden coaster before they find the log flume and look straight ahead. But if I move the wooden coaster one tile back, then they detect the log flume first and look up instead. If the guest has a food or drink item, an umbrella, a balloon, a hat or sunglasses, they cannot look up as there are no sprites for that, so then they will always look straight ahead. The one item that does not prevent this, that does alter their appearance, is the t-shirt, as that merely changes the color of their shirt that they are already wearing anyway. While they are looking at the amazingly cool thing, there is a number of animations that they can perform. The game attempts to do one of these twice for every time the time to watch counter goes down by 1, so it ranges from attempting this 5 times a second to 20 times a second, depending on the energy of the guest. During an attempt, guests always have a 1% chance to take a picture, which is something that you have seen them do throughout this entire video. If they're watching a ride that is still under construction, then there's also a 1% chance that they will scratch their head. The code calls it a wave, but to me it looks like they're scratching their head, being like, wonder what this is gonna be. And lastly, if they have a food item, then there is a 2% chance on every attempt that they will eat or drink from it. That doesn't have anything to do with how fast they consume the item, by the way, it's just an animation they can do while they have it, making the game look more lively. Whilst performing these animations, the time to watch timer does not decrease, making them stand around for longer. So in reality, this curve will almost never be correct, and it's rather the minimum standing time, which can be increased by random picture taking, head scratching or their food item consumption. There are also two thoughts that they can get from watching stuff. If it's a new ride under construction, so a closed ride with no ratings yet, then they will think, wow, a new ride being built. If it's a scenery item they're looking at, then they instead will think that the park has great scenery. This second one helps with qualifying for the most beautiful park award, but unlike when guests get this thought from there just being a lot of scenery items around, here it provides no happiness boost, and neither does the new ride thought. That does make me ponder, should you actively block guests from watching rides? In normal gameplay this of course doesn't matter, but if you want to try to optimize as much as possible, then you could spend some time surrounding your paths with opaque walls so that guests cannot watch the rides. After all, if they're stuck admiring something, then they're not riding a ride. So if it's a paper ride park, then they're not making you money and they also don't gain any happiness from it. It only very slightly helps with the most beautiful park award, and you can get that by building a lot of small scenery items anyway. So yeah, this is of course entirely irrelevant for normal parks and even enhances the gameplay because it's fun to see guests admire the things that you've built. But if you ever want to make certain numbers go up as much as possible, it could be worth it to prevent guests from watching rides and scenery. And that is finally everything you need to know about how and when guests watch rides or scenery and what the effects are. It is insanely detailed and complicated for how small of an effect this is, but it is truly a sign of how much of a labor of love and passion these games were for Chris Sawyer. I mean, 4 object attributes, photogenicity, transparency, interestingness and slightly interestingness, were created purely for ride watching and aren't used anywhere else. That's pure madness. If you want to learn about more obscure things, you can click here for a video looking at all the pre-built designs in the game. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.